Thank you again for coming this morning. We have a very full program for you. I want to introduce Dan Stevens. He's the Executive Vice President of, come on up, Pacific Source Health Plans. So as you saw in the video, the Bend Chamber provides health care insurance for a lot of groups across the state. Right now we insure over 13,000 people. And we're very proud to do that and provide that service to our members in Central Oregon and across the state. And with gratitude for helping bring Lindsay Piegza here and for supporting the Chamber, I'd like to welcome Dan to the stage.
Morning, everyone. Thank you. I'm not going to talk about health insurance this morning. I think my happiest moment on the video is that I didn't wear the same shirt today as I wore on the video. So what foresight. Pacific Source is really proud to be a sponsor this year, along with Brooks Resources, of today's great event. And I think if I just took a moment and you asked me what my favorite thing was about the Bend Chamber right now, it's that this is an organization that doesn't stop asking, what can we do next? And I think that in the context of helping local businesses thrive in our regional economy, that's an easy question for a chamber to ask. But as you saw from the video, and if you know about the Child Care Accelerator Program, some of the other programs like the Lifetime Leaders Program that the Chamber had kicked off in 2019. The what can we do next question isn't about just helping businesses thrive. It's about what we can do to help our local community and our economy thrive more broadly. So I just want to take a moment and thank Katie and your team and the board members of the Bend Chamber for not just continuing to ask that question, what can we do next? And not only that, but then acting on it. So thanks a lot. Round of applause. So Damon, welcome back. Damon has been a part of this program for a number of years now, and I have the great pleasure of introducing him. I'm going to say a few things about him, and Damon, you can, as I did, come on up on the stage and listen to me talk about you for a second. Damon Runberg is a state economist with the Oregon Employment Department covering Central Oregon and the Klamath Basin. He calculates the monthly employment estimates for the area's counties. Additionally, he tracks various economic indicators critical to the region's economy. He also writes prolifically and regularly gives presentations, such as this morning, on the state of our local economy. Damon is a native Oregonian who's lived in Bend for the past number of years, received his Master of Public Policy from Oregon State University in Corvallis.
Go Beavs.
Where he specialized in econometric analysis and natural resource economy. Before that, he received his undergrad from Gonzaga University.
Go Zags.
And I know many of you look forward to this presentation every year and Damon sharing his insights. I heard something this week that I took it to another level for me. I was talking to somebody who was going to also be here this morning. And they said, yeah, I was having a conversation with my husband. I have to go drop the kids off at childcare, and I wasn't sure if I'd be able to make it over here in time. And my husband said, let me do the kids. You get there, because Damon's speaking again, right? And she said, yes, he is. He said, we're putting our house on the market next year, and I need you to hear from Damon what month we should put our house on the market. So that just kind of brought it to a whole new level for me. And so get your pencils out and welcome Damon to the stage for me. Thanks.
Thanks, Dan. Oh my gosh, so many friendly faces. What a pleasure to be here again. Happy Halloween, everyone. Please, if you're buying a house or selling a house by what I say, I don't get paid enough for that responsibility. So don't hold me accountable to anything like that. But it is good to know that people care about what's going on in the local economy. We all should care to some extent, right? And this room looks really full right now. Is there something going on that we're all a little curious about, that this room is fuller than normal? Maybe it's always this full. Maybe the downstairs room is a bit of a black hole, and so people just disappear. But there's a lot of you guys here, and there's a lot of curiosity right now about what's going on in the local economy, what's going on in the national economy. And as usual, I have to get there through talking about something that has nothing to do with the economy. Today, we're going to talk about Legos a little bit. I have a 4.5-year-old, and I have an 18-month-old. My 4.5-year-old recently just moved into what I like to call the Lego phase. Anyone familiar with the Lego phase? Oh yeah, a lot of hands. I presume at some point in your lives, most of you were children, or you have children or your children were once young. So I think we all hit this category where the Lego phase was once an opportunity for us to reach. Well, my daughter just got there, and I gotta say, it is the most fun stage because, you know, with little kids, you sort of play with them and stuff, but it's really fun to have this like tangible thing where we get to sort of build and craft together, right? It often is her asking me to build some sort of vehicle or structure to carry the things that she built. And so the other day I built a very nice yellow submarine, her request. We don't have any yellow Legos, so it was a non-yellow yellow submarine. But needless to say, Legos are fun, right? And I think the thing that we love the most about Legos is that we take chaos. This is chaos, right? This mess. We all know the big old pile of just gross, unorganized Legos. We take that and we organize them into some sort of structure and turn them into something like this, right? We turn them into some sort of organized, beautiful scene. Now, I'm going to clarify, I'm not building scenes like this. I'm just saying you could have a really cool retro record store scene if you were more organized than me or more patient. But it's really awesome to be able to take this chaos and turn it into a focused, organized structure, right? And for us, I was thinking recently, of course, this is how I would think about it. I was sitting there making a yellow submarine and thought to myself, man, this is a lot like the economy, isn't it? And follow along here. We're getting there. We'll pull this around. All of us sitting in this room, all of us individuals are economic agents, okay? We all have our own ambitions and wishes and purchases and debts and whatever it might be, okay? When you look at each of us individually and just a big pile of economic agents, just like that pile of Legos, it's chaos. It's a mess. I'm sorry, you guys look very dapper this morning, but there is a lot of chaos that I'm looking at right now. But what happens is when we organize this chaos together and we start to build things together, we turn into something more tangible, something we could quantify. And so we turn into a structure, just like Legos. We organize each of us individual agents into something that is a community. So those of us here in Central Oregon and the greater Bend metro area, we are a community. And communities are tied by geography, by place, they're tied by interest, they're tied by skills, whatever it might be. But we can define these places, these built structures, and we can know more about them in a way that we can't know much about the individual agents, the pile of Legos that is just confusing and messy. And so when you look at the economic trends that we've seen in our built community, in our place that we live in Central Oregon, we see a history of highs and lows. We're all very familiar with this history, right? In fact, some people like to call it our traditional boom-bust cycle. Well, it's not, that might be a little extreme. I don't think we're quite boom-busty, but we are pretty good looking these days, that's for sure. We have gone through one of our strongest histories, I'll say the strongest history of economic expansion we've ever seen in Central Oregon. The rates of job growth that we saw in this expansion never really peaked as high as we saw in the last one, but it has been more robust, more sustained, more consistent. This is good times. It's been an amazing, amazing economic expansion here in Central Oregon. So applause to all of the business owners out there who have been doing such great work hiring all these folks, and also for the hard workers who are helping contribute to these businesses. It has been a great time for us here in Central Oregon. But if you look at the tail of this graph, we see that our rates of growth on the right-hand side, is that your right? Yeah, it's a little weird when you're backwards. We're tailing off a little bit, aren't we? Our rates of growth are starting to slow down. And this is what we're entering what I like to call the deceleration phase. So we're still expanding, we're still adding jobs across the region. I know there's a lot of concern out there about a recession potentially, but we're still growing. We're still seeing some real positive gains. We're just starting to decelerate. We're riding those brakes a little bit, we're moving forward. There's a little bit of a dip that you might see towards the tail there. There's a drop that happened. Over the course of the summer, I was sort of on the pulpit preaching that our job growth had pretty much stalled out. We've dropped to growth rates of nearly 0%. So we were the same this year as we were last year. Those original estimates, it turns out, were overstating the slowdown that we were seeing in the local economy. It turns out we weren't actually growing as slowly as we thought we were. The reason why is we build our monthly estimates off of payroll tax records that are always like 6 months old, about. So the most recent month that I had available was March 2019. Do we remember March 2019 in Central Oregon? Anybody? Some people were probably sledding, others were shoveling their roofs. But we often talk about how weather events can really affect these employment or unemployment numbers. And that was definitely the case what we saw here. So we were building our monthly estimates through the summer off an artificially low month. Well, 2 weeks ago, we just got the final second quarter numbers through June, and guess what happened? It rebounded a bit. So we're still on the downward trend. Our economy is most definitely slowing. We're not growing at the paces that we had seen, but a lot of the news that we heard this summer about job rate being almost equal to what it was last year was a little overblown, and we're sitting with growth somewhere around 2 to 3%. So we're doing all right, Central Oregon, all right? Not too much to be worried about at this point. So we are slowing. This is actually happening. But why is it happening? Why is the economy slowing today? So when you're building Lego structures, you probably remember, if you put yourself back in the day, you'll probably remember that when you're building the structure originally, all those blocks in the foundation are really quick. You got the big blocks, the big rectangular ones, and you sort of build up this boat real quick, okay? It doesn't take much time to get the foundation going. But as you build your structure and it gets bigger and bigger, and you start getting closer to it being completed, the pace of growth slows down, right? It's really hard when you're putting those finishing touches on, or if you've ever actually built a real house, framing a house is pretty quick, but the finish work, putting in the dang trim takes 10 times as long as building the whole house. That's a good analogy for what we're seeing today in our local economy. Our pace of growth is slowing dramatically, mostly because a lot of the energy, a lot of the pent-up demand was eaten out really quickly of the business cycle. We had a lot of slack in our local labor market, and that was seen really from the depths of the recession until about 2017. And then our employment levels relative to where we would expect them to be based on the population growth we've seen sort of evened out in around 2017. So a lot of the slack was eaten out of the market. The low-hanging fruit of expansion was gone. So now think of our economy as being sort of this beautiful Lego structure that we're putting those finishing touches on, and we just can't sustain these rates of growth. We're not building the foundation anymore. We're making ourselves look nice and pretty right now. So as we move forward, though, there's a question of, where are we today? What does this look like? Does this immediately move us into recession, into negative categories? And I think where we're sitting today is this mystical concept. You may have heard this before, called full employment. I'm sure some have heard of this. There's actually no legit, real sort of great definition for this. Another mystical concept is called the natural rate of unemployment, which is sort of what the normal rate of employment would be in your community if there was no cyclical nature of the business cycle. I think we're somewhere around this mythical concept where everyone who wants a job can have one. And the reason why is because, for the most part, we've taken out a lot of, we'll still always have frictional unemployment, which is where people leave jobs voluntarily, and we'll always have our seasonal unemployment based on our concentration of industries that we have. The tourism industry is very important to us, so is construction, both highly seasonal. So we'll always have some unemployment, but we've been stuck at 3 years at 4% unemployment. So I think we're pretty close to this mythical concept. We're almost there at this sort of full employment or at our natural rate of unemployment, which is good for us. That click? There we go. But the slowing, what is going on with the slowing? We should have known, the writing was really on the wall a couple years ago that the economy was going to start slowing down dramatically. And the reason why, one of our best leading indicators we have is job ads from local businesses. We have access to this information, and today's job ad turns into tomorrow's job. So it gives us insight into the future. Well, in reality, it's not tomorrow's job. Today's job ad turns into a payroll job usually 6 months from now that we're recording. But because of that, it is an amazing leading indicator that gives us insight into the future. And hiring demand in 2017 and 2018 slowed dramatically, dramatically. We saw it sort of drop off that cliff you can see there. And then as we've moved into 2019, we've continued that slow descent where hiring demand has continued to go downward. So what does that tell us about the future? Are we going to start seeing a ramp up in hiring again in Central Oregon? Likely not. But what you can see is the last few months, it looks like we're plateauing a bit right now. It looks like we're starting to flatten out as far as labor demand. And we might be entering this period here where I like to think of it as the money zone. Most people look at this graph and they are fearful of it, but this might actually be a spot, if we could stall out in this region of labor demand, this is a great spot where workers still have mobility. They still have opportunities to find a new career path, to move up that career ladder, and still opportunities for new entrants into our labor market to find a job. So if we could sort of stay in this level of labor demand, that's actually pretty good for us in Central Oregon. Now, if it declines much further than that, it might be more concerning. But at the moment, we might be at an equilibrium, if you will. So another really important relationship we look at is this relationship between the supply of labor, we'll use unemployed workers, to the demand for labor, these job ads that are out there. And this ratio is really important. We try to pay attention to it through the years because it gives us a lot of insight into what's going on in the local labor market. So when that ratio is really high, when there's a lot of unemployed people and few job ads, that's when the economy is too cold, right, up in this part. We don't like that. That's not good times, not good for our community. So we want to pay attention to when things happen like that. Not good for businesses because there's probably not a lot of demand for their goods or services, and really not good for workers because they can't find a job. But there are other times in the business cycle, and we just got out of this piece right here, where the demand for labor is really, really high, workers are really valuable, but at the same time, it's really difficult to find the workers for businesses. So it's a tough time for businesses. They want to expand, and they can't because they can't find qualified workers. And at the same time, workers are in high demand. It's good for them. They actually see really robust wage gains in this part of the business cycle. And by the way, this is a part of Central Oregon's recent expansion that I don't think we give enough credit to. We saw some of the most robust wage gains we've ever seen in Central Oregon's history. I'll say the best we have in recorded history, because it only goes back to like the 70s. Maybe back in the 60s we did better, I don't know. But it has been a phenomenal expansion as far as workers doing better, having more real dollars in their pocket than they've ever had. Some of this is the diversification of our economy, but some of it is when we actually look at payroll records of workers. Incumbent workers, those who have stayed employed at the same company, are actually seeing substantive wage gains. So this was a good time for workers, but overall, there's some weaknesses here too. So maybe the economy is a little bit too hot. But there's a middle ground here. There's sort of a not too hot, not too cold, that just right, like the porridge analogy, where a point where there's just a slightly higher number of unemployed workers and labor demand is just a little bit lower. And this creates all sorts of opportunities. It means businesses could find workers. It's not nearly as difficult to find the right worker out there. It also means that there's enough mobility and opportunities for workers to find a job and new entrances moving to our labor market. So we might have new people moving to Central Oregon. They can find a job, as well as young people who are graduating and looking for their first job. This is a great spot that we're sitting in right now. We sort of glide path into a point where it's sort of mutually beneficial for both workers and businesses right now. We're just in that just right zone. So, do any of our local signs point to a recession or anything we should be particularly concerned about at the local level? Well, the answer is no. If anything, this might be the best time we've ever had. We've just finished this phase of amazing wage growth. Things are loosening up a little bit for businesses to find workers. Workers are still able to find jobs. It's a pretty good time. But we have to understand that recessions aren't a local phenomenon, right? We are recipients of recessions. We are not the ones that are causing it by any means. If we were the cause of a recession, that would be pretty cool, actually. But we don't have that much power. Cool it'd make us feel real important. But it's not going to be that way. These are large macroeconomic trends, forces that we have no control over. We're recipients of, right? So remember that we are this group of individuals, economic agents, and we're aggregated up into a community. We are Central Oregon. But if we want to continue this analogy of the sort of the Legos, have you ever seen one of these massive Lego towns? My nephew recently went to, is it Lego World? Legoland, thank you. I got to figure this one out before my daughter gets a little older. So Legoland, and he took a picture next to this massive town that was built. So if we take this analogy further, we're just one structure, those of us in Central Oregon, in this massive townscape that is this Lego village, okay? We are recipients of what's going on in this scene. We're not driving the ship or anything like that. So for us, shocks can happen to this Lego town, right? Bad things can happen, and the best bad thing I could think of, if we're going to continue the toy analogy, has anyone ever seen Toy Story 3? I know once we start getting into massive sequels, people are like, I didn't ever saw the fifth one, but I think I saw the second. Toy Story 3 is my favorite, just saying. My daughter loves this one too. We watched this one together. There's a point in Toy Story 3 where our favorite toy friends that we remember from all the movies find themselves in a daycare facility. By the way, we need more daycare facilities, so thank you, Katie, and your team for encouraging more daycare facilities. Childcare might be as much of an issue for us as housing in Central Oregon. But back to Toy Story 3. So our favorite toys are sitting in a daycare facility. They get assigned to the toddler room. I don't know if you know anything about toddlers. They're a bit abusive with toys, it turns out. And they don't know this at the time, though, so these toys plop themselves down in front of the door. So you hear the kids running in from recess, the door swings open, and just a stampede of little sticky-fingered toddlers run amok on these toys. At one point, you see one of the dolls being used as a paintbrush, dipping her hair in it. I think the other one here, I freeze-framed this from YouTube, so excuse the pixelated nature, but this was my favorite. Mrs. Potato Head is used as a toddler chew toy, okay? Not an appropriate use of Mrs. Potato Head. So, needless to say, this is a shock to the system, right? These toys were sitting there right in front of this shock that hit them right in the face. But if you really pay attention to the scene, which is really interesting, is the experience toys, the ones that weren't new. Where did they go? They all sort of like hid to the corners and the crevices of the room because they knew how destructive these toys were, or not these toys, these toddlers were. And they knew how sticky fingers can really disrupt the mobility of a toy arm or whatever, right? So not everybody in this room was affected by the shock in the same way. Some were insulated from it to some extent. Everyone was affected, but some worse than others. And if we think about us here in Central Oregon, during that last economic shock, the one that caused the Great Recession, we were the toys standing in front of the door receiving the toddlers running us over, right? That's where we stood. We were particularly vulnerable to the last shock that happened. However, I think we are much better suited today for whatever the next shock might be. We're not standing in front of the door. We're not going to be bulldozed in the same way by toddlers running us over. We are one of those toys that slid to the side of the room, and yes, we're going to be affected to some extent. We're not going to be completely insulated, but we are also not getting the full brunt of what's going to happen next. We're not vulnerable in the same way. And why is that the case? If you look at the businesses that have expanded and grown in Central Oregon, there's not a single trend where you could really connect the dots with all of these. Very diverse growth, businesses that follow different parts of the business plan, and growth patterns that are very, they're not homogeneous at all. There's just no continuity between them. Now, we have elements of our economy that will always be hit hard during a recession. Tourism, for instance. What's the one thing that you do when you lose your job or you have to sort of tighten up your spending habits? You're likely got to stop going on vacation, right? So we're going to see tourism will be affected if there's a future recession. Construction maybe a little bit. But ultimately, I would make the argument that construction still is undersized. We need to be building up our construction industry right now, not worried about it shrinking or collapsing anytime soon. So I think we're in a much better position to be prepared for this next shock that might happen. And in a second here, Lindsay's got to come up, and I'm going to introduce her. But I want you all in the audience to think in the back of your mind, what are those shocks that we are particularly vulnerable to here in Central Oregon? Have a keen ear to what she's talking about and think if these things that she's saying that are worrisome, are concerning, are ones that are actually relevant to us or not. Because like I said, not every shock's the same, and it's almost a guarantee that different recessions are caused by different shocks. So I'll put my money on saying a housing bubble bursting is not going to be what the next recession is. And so whatever that might be, it's going to affect us in one way or the other. But are we standing to the side of the room, or are we standing in front of the door? So thank you. Go play with Legos, everyone. It's fun. If you need to get a hold of me, there's my stuff. But I have the unique pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker this morning as well. Dr. Lindsay Pigzey is the chief economist with Stifel Financial. She specializes in the research and analysis of economic trends and activity, world economies, financial markets, and monetary and fiscal policies. Prior to her role with Stifel, she was the senior economist for the investment bank in New York City for 8 years, consulting clients in the U.S., Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. A highly sought-after speaker, that we're lucky to have, across national and international forums. Pigzeh is often quoted in the business press. She's a regular guest on CNBC, Fox News, CNN, and Bloomberg, as well as national radio and other business news outlets. Lindsay is also a monthly op-ed contributor for The Hill, in addition to her role with Stifel, right? Okay, I want to make sure I'm getting it right. Pigzeh is an instructor at the Pacific Coast Banking School, a member of the Chicago Federal Reserve Advisory Committee, and a well-respected author. Lindsay has published numerous academic papers in prestigious journals such as the Harvard Business Review and in textbooks from Northwestern University's Kellogg Graduate School of Management. Pigzeh is a member of the National Association for Business Economics and American Economic Association. She holds 2 degrees from Northwestern University. What's your mascot there?
Wildcats.
Oh my gosh. Stumped her already,
It's been a
guys. And she earned her PhD in economics from the City University of New York. She's a native of Chicago and is based in the downtown Chicago office. So everyone welcome me or help me welcome Lindsay to the stage. So, is that?
Thank you very much. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome. Let me start by thanking you for joining me here today and giving me this incredible opportunity to present the economic outlook. Now, I've entitled this morning's presentation, Policy Seems as Appropriate, despite evidence of mounting weakness. Because that's really where we are in the cycle at this point. We're seeing growing evidence of weakness, not only bubbling underneath the surface, but becoming a clear downward trend across a number of key sectors of the economy, be that manufacturing, business investment, even the consumer showing signs of weakness now. And this not only justifies the Federal Reserve's decision to lower rates in July and September, and then of course yesterday as well, but it perpetuates the potential need for further Fed action as we look out to the end of the year and beyond into 2020. Now, you may be aware that the Fed characterized earlier decisions to cut rates as a mid-cycle recalibration, an insurance-style cut, if you will. And this language was used again yesterday to describe that third-round rate cut. But going forward, with a rising risk of a global recession, and of course, as I just mentioned, mounting weakness here at home on the domestic front, it's going to be increasingly difficult for the Fed to continue to characterize any additional action as insurance, as opposed to outright support for a faltering economy. So at this point in the cycle, after 3 rate cuts now behind us, the Fed would prefer to take a pause, lest they be forced to acknowledge the weakness in the economy. Now, as I mentioned, nope, I guess that's it. Oh, can we go back one? Okay, now forward one. Try clicking again. All right, I've mastered the clicker. Now, as I mentioned, the Fed had described yesterday's rate decision, still using that language, as an insurance-style cut. So essentially talking about this was preventative action against potential external shocks. The U.S. economy, the Federal Reserve told us, is on favorable footing, and so this policy action over the past 4 months was simply to keep the economy on that favorable footing. But how much insurance? Because we're now talking about 75 basis points of cuts. Going forward, any additional policy action, meaning any further rate cuts, well, the market's probably going to interpret that as the Fed acknowledging weakness in the economy and potentially revising lower their forecast for economic growth and inflation. So it makes sense that the Fed at this point would rather pause, erring on the side of caution, out of concern that any further policy action could actually undermine confidence in the marketplace and actually overshadow the potential benefits from lower borrowing costs for businesses and consumers. Now, speaking of low borrowing costs, let's remind ourselves where we're coming from in terms of this rate cycle. Because it wasn't too long ago that the Fed was actually raising rates. If you look at the chart all the way to the right-hand side of the chart, we're talking about 9 rate hikes or 225 basis points of rate increases. But the Fed finally decided that at some point, late last year, it was time to sit on the sideline and pause. And we finally saw mid-part this year the first rate cut in 10 years. Now, on a historical basis, I always like to put this in historical context, rates were already historically low. We were already at very low levels of rates. Take a look at the peak of where we were this cycle relative to where we were going into the Great Recession or going into the 2001 recession, about half of where we were. So we were already talking about extremely accommodative policy. Nevertheless, as I mentioned at the end of last year, the Fed finally decided that policy had reached neutral, and by the mid part of this year, that policy had moved into restrictive territory, warranting 3 rate reductions over the past 4 months. So while the Fed remains generally optimistic about the economy, as they always do, what we see is that with rates starting from already such an extremely low level, the Fed has very little ammunition, very limited tools in their toolbox to combat eventual weakness as we see it lurking around the corner. And so the Fed doesn't have the luxury of erring on the side of caution or slow playing support for the economy. In fact, with rates starting at such a low level, we would argue the Fed needs to be more aggressive than they normally would be or they have been in previous cycles, getting out ahead of the weakness. Now, the recent policy action and commentary should be relatively positive for the markets because the Fed is telling us that they're still seeing domestic fundamentals as relatively positive and that earlier Fed action is enough to stave off any sort of future weakness. And in fact, we do see that the equity markets seem to be buying into that more positive commentary, with risk assets now pushing back to earlier September highs, near September high levels. The fixed income market also buying into recent Fed commentary, talking about earlier policy being enough to stabilize the US economy. The outlook or the probability priced into the market at this point for a 4th round cut by the end of the year has fallen from over 50% to below 30%. So the market really buying into the Fed's commentary that at this point, maybe they've done enough to stabilize the economy. But despite what the Fed tells us, it's going to be all about the data. The data is really going to determine the pathway for policy. Policy, as the chairman tells us time and time again, is not on a preset course. So what I want to do now is let's walk through the data and see if you feel as optimistic as some of the Fed members would like you to feel. Now, yesterday, I'm sure everyone was sitting at the edge of their chairs listening to the Fed chairman's testimony for the few hours after the rate announcement. But if you didn't, don't worry, we'll pick out the highlights for you here. And one of them was the Fed chairman telling us that the U.S. economy is on favorable footing, and basically the outlook for the U.S. economy remains pretty favorable. Now, as I mentioned, the Fed is generally optimistic, so this is nothing new. But let's look at the data from the U.S. economy and see if that really supports that type of positive characterization. Now, I certainly would agree with the Fed chairman that the U.S. economy remains in positive territory, but it's hard to say that this is outright favorable conditions when we're talking about 2 consecutive quarters now of waning momentum. The economy was growing at an above 3% pace at the start of the year. That slowed to circa 2% in the second quarter, and the latest Q3 GDP report that was also released yesterday shows now that the U.S. economy has slowed to a below 2% pace. Now, the nominal reading, the slowdown over the past 6 months, in and of itself, is very concerning. But beyond that slowdown on the nominal, from a nominal perspective, one of the biggest concerns I have is the composition of growth. Now, as we heard Damon talk about, one of the things that we want for an economy is diversification. But as you can see in the second and final bar, all the way to the right-hand side, there's a pretty large component there dominating growth, that dark blue bar, and that's the consumer. And in fact, the consumer was the sole organic support to growth over the past 6 months.
Oh, thank you.
All other categories, business investment, trade, inventories, These were all net drags on the national economy, begging the question, can the consumer continue to solely support the economy going forward? And this is something we'll circle back to. We'll come look at the consumer a little more, but I want to leave that question hanging out there for you. As we look at the composition, clearly we're relying on a one-trick pony here. And the recovery overall has been relatively disappointing. Also, as Damon mentioned, this is the longest in post-World War II history, absolutely. But the longest doesn't necessarily translate into the strongest. And in fact, what we see is that this has been the weakest recovery on the books, with an average growth rate of just 2.3%. Now, typically, when we talk about the economy recovering in the aftermath of a recessionary period, we're able to see a sustained growth rate of 3, 4, in some cases 5%. This time around, we're talking about 2-ish. 2%, folks, is really the bare minimum that we should expect from a recovering economy. 1% from productivity gains, 1% from population growth, there's your 2%. And somehow we're supposed to be celebrating 2.3? That doesn't feel very robust, or as the chairman said, favorable, in my opinion.
Oh my God.
Going forward, we do expect the U.S. economy to remain in positive territory. That's the glass half full. Glass half empty, we do expect a noticeable loss of momentum as we head into the final quarter of the year and round forward into 2020. With the risk of the R word, yes, recession, rapidly rising in our opinion, if we do not see more of a stabilization in this rapidly declining trend across, as I mentioned, a number of key sectors. The Fed also acknowledging the likelihood of a slowdown relative to what we've seen in years past, but they're a little more optimistic in their forecast, as they always are, looking for growth to stabilize around a 2% growth rate. But in fact, what we see is looking at the meeting minutes from last month, there are a number of Fed officials that have come out and they are increasingly concerned about the downside risks to the economy. And in fact, based on their internal proprietary models, see a rising risk of recession as well. So again, that top-line forecast they put out for you and I to read remains relatively optimistic around 2%, but behind the scenes, there is a growing level of concern about downside risks and the risk of an outright recession. Now, part of the differential between our forecast and the Fed's forecast comes down to the labor market. How we see the labor market. It's all about jobs. Jobs, jobs, jobs. Putting Americans back to work, keeping Americans in a gainful position of employment. And the Fed is pretty optimistic, excuse me, about the labor market. According to a number of metrics, the chairman told us, the labor market seems to be on solid footing. Well, let's take a look at the data, let you decide. I certainly would agree with the chairman that job growth is still positive. We're still putting Americans back to work on a month-to-month basis, but we're doing so at a noticeably reduced clip. Now, last year, as you can see by that red line, the average pace of hiring was around 225,000. That has slowed noticeably now to 160,000 on average. So we're talking across the first 8 months of the year, we've hired about 500,000 fewer workers than we did this time last year. Again, still positive, but what we're seeing is that second derivative decline, a slower pace of positive growth. And I think you can more clearly see that here on this chart. We're looking here on a 6-month and a 12-month rolling average in terms of the pace of hiring. Back in 2015, if you can follow that up to the peak, we were hiring at a pace close to 280,000. That slowed noticeably through 2015 to a trough in 2016. We started to recapture some of that labor momentum in 2017, but really only recaptured about half of what we had lost. And more recently, you can see that steep downward trend, with the average pace falling well below 200,000. Now, why do I specifically point out 200,000? Well, that's the average growth in terms of job creation that we need on a month-to-month basis just to cover demographic change, just to cover population growth, first-time entrants into the labor market. We need on average 200,000 new jobs each month. And we're failing to do that both on a 6-month and a 12-month average at this point.
Yeah, I love toys, so anytime.
And it's not just about the number of jobs that we're creating. I'm sure that everyone in this room, like myself, gets incredibly excited about Non-Farm Payroll Friday, the most exciting day of any month. But it's not just about that top-line number. It's also about the quality of jobs that we're creating. Because at this point in the recovery, 11 years into the recovery, we should be talking about full-time, high-wage, high-quality job creation. But instead, what we're seeing is that businesses around the country are still relying on low-wage, temporary, part-time labor. In fact, when we break it down on a monthly basis, we see that these categories often account for about 50% or more of the monthly job creation. So on Friday, we have Non-Farm Payroll Friday. When that number comes out, challenge yourself not just to get excited about that headline number, but read in the details and see what kind of jobs we're actually creating. Because at this point, we're still seeing a reliance, again, on those part-time, low-wage, temporary employment positions. What about the unemployment rate? Let's talk about some good news for a second. The unemployment rate, 3.5% with Oregon not far behind, that's pretty impressive. Does anyone remember the aftermath of the Great Recession when unemployment was 10%? Well, 3.5 feels much better. 3.5% not only gets us into what the Fed calls that full employment range, as Damon was talking about, but we fell below that lower bound. And this isn't a one-off data point. As you can see, we've been there for quite some time. So if we just looked at the unemployment level, the unemployment rate, this would suggest, as the Fed has, that the labor market is extremely strong. But we also know 3.5% doesn't tell the whole story. 3.5% doesn't include the millions of Americans that are sitting on the sideline, not counted in the unemployment number, and dragging down the participation rate to a multi-decade low. How do we calculate unemployment in this country? You have to be actively seeking a job to be counted as unemployed. So I always say it's very easy to get the unemployment rate down to 0 if nobody's looking for work.
Thanks.
That was a joke, guys. Wow. That's a little economist humor. All right, I promise. That's my only joke. This is a tough crowd. All right, we're just gonna move on here. Now you may hear, or you may have heard about the decline in the participation rate. The media often covers this, and they do so from the standpoint of don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. These were individuals that were at retirement age, nearing retirement age. They were gonna drop out anyway. But in fact, what we see is the vast majority of dropouts are aged 20 to 55, 20 to 55-year-olds. So especially the 20-somethings, the 30-somethings, unless they're independently wealthy, we would expect at some point for these individuals to come into the labor market, then putting upward pressure on the unemployment rate. But what's happening that we're seeing such an extreme decline in the participation rate? Where are these individuals going? Well, it's not an easy answer, and it's certainly not a singular answer. Excuse me, it's that time of year, got a little cold. But there are a number of trends that help us explain the decline in the labor force participation rate. Now, in part, absolutely, it is an aging population issue. We see 10,000 baby boomers a day reach retirement age. I'm not implying 10,000 a day retire, that's a personal decision. 10,000 a day reach that age threshold. But even after we account for the most senior Americans, as I mentioned, we're still seeing a steep decline in participation 20 to 55-year-olds. So where are these individuals going? Well, a couple of things that we're seeing. One, how about a rising rate of disability, with nearly 25 million Americans self-identifying as disabled? How about childcare costs? Something that we were talking about earlier and we saw in the video, not only costs but availability. Now, depending on the type of childcare service that you use, we estimate costs have gone up 20 to 40% over just the past couple of years. And this is particularly important talking about the female labor force participation rate. Men are absolutely a very important component in terms of child rearing, but still traditionally that predominantly falls on the female of the household. And what we're seeing is that a lot of women across this country are looking at what they're making in the private sector relative to what they're paying in terms of childcare costs, And for some families, this doesn't make sense. And we're actually seeing a mass exodus of women from the labor market. How about the cash economy? The cash economy. This is something that's really picking up, particularly among the younger generation. Maybe I fix cars and this young man teaches yoga. We meet on a website online and we exchange goods and services, and the government has no way of tracking that. There's no payroll receipts. There's no tax receipts. And this is becoming a growing phenomenon in the economy. Now, we don't have great data on this, as it is sort of seen as the underground economy, but the Fed estimates that the cash economy has now grown to somewhere between 5 to 15% of the economy. Not a huge slice, but 5 to 15%, I don't think it's something that we can ignore. But one of the most alarming components that we've seen in terms of impacting a decline in participation is the opioid epidemic. The opioid epidemic. Now, we've seen some earlier studies. The McKinsey Group did a great study. The Brookings Institute did a great study. And they found a positive correlation between the number of opioid prescriptions being written in an area and a decline in the local participation rate. But more recently, the Cleveland Fed came out with a very intense, very geospecific, granular study. And they found that they could account for nearly 50% of the decline in male participation directly tied to opioid and prescription drug addiction. That is an alarming number. And it certainly makes sense now why it is getting such national attention, both from our officials in the White House as well as our officials in the Federal Reserve. You may have caught Chairman Powell's interview a few weeks back, maybe several weeks back now, on 60 Minutes. And he also took a small portion of his time to talk about the impact of the opioid crisis on the future of the labor force. So a number of issues that we're facing. The Fed says the labor market is favorable. We see a number of red flags, including a lingering skills mismatch. Now, what we're looking at here is the JOLT survey. You may not be familiar with that. Essentially, this is the jobs openings survey. It shows us the number of vacancies in the labor market. And just like the one that Damon showed on the local level, you can see that this is rising, but it's tapering off a little bit. But there's still ample openings for employment opportunities in this economy. But one of the problems that we hear about consistently when I'm talking across the country to big businesses, small businesses, is not the number of resumes coming across their desk, but the skills within that resume. They can have 100 resumes trying to fill one job vacancy, but no one has the math, engineering, maybe computer science skills needed to fill that position. So what a lot of businesses are saying, it's not about the number of applicants, but it's about the quality of applicants. We have a skills mismatch out in the labor market. So another issue that's weighing on labor market conditions. Now, with the labor market showing signs of red flags, as I would say, this certainly should be a red flag for the consumer going forward. Now, as we saw at this point, the consumer remains the engine of the U.S. economy, as we saw the sole support, in fact, to Q2 growth, to Q3 growth. But can the consumer continue to carry the economy alone if we continue to see a declining trend in the other key sectors of the economy? Well, the Fed seems to think so. They say household spending continues to be strong, supported by a healthy job market, rising income, and solid consumer confidence. Well, we just talked about the job market. Still positive, but losing momentum. Let's hold off on talking about incomes. Let's start with solid consumer confidence. And here I would actually agree with the Fed. Certainly, we are seeing solid consumer confidence. A nice run-up, although to be fair, we're clearly off peak levels reached just about a year earlier. But one thing to keep in mind is that confidence is not even across the country. In fact, if we look at this on a year-over-year basis, the vast majority of the country has actually seen a precipitous decline in confidence. It's really only East-South Central, the East-South Central region of the country that's still in positive territory. If we look at the Plain States, down nearly 12%, the Midwest about 10%, over to the South Atlantica region, confidence has fallen 15%. So you see a lot of volatility in the levels of confidence across the country. And it is this uneven level of confidence then that is translated into such an uneven level of spending, particularly when we look at discretionary purchases, which really is a good proxy for the financial flexibility of the American consumer. Does the consumer have enough discretionary income to go out into the marketplace and buy a new big screen TV or buy a new spring dress, or no, I guess winter coat now in this season? So looking at retail sales, the first thing that I hope you notice is a tremendous amount of volatility. If we were talking about an extremely solid consumer, what you would expect was a sustained upward trend in terms of monthly spending. Also, when it comes to the categories, we would expect to see a simultaneous rise across many, if not all, categories. Consumers buying that winter coat and that big screen TV at the same time because they're on such sound financial footing. But instead, what we're seeing is the consumer very dramatically shifting the goods and services in their basket on a month-to-month basis. Maybe they are buying that new winter coat, but in doing so, they have to forego eating out, buying that big screen TV, maybe buying that new set of Legos. So there's a very dramatic shift in terms of the goods and services on a month-to-month basis. And in fact, even when we smooth out some of that volatility, looking at the red lines, you can still see a very clear cyclical pattern. Back in 2017, we were binge spending in anticipation of tax reform. When we saw the actual realization of 2018's tax reform with a rising burden, particularly on the state and local level, many consumers found they had to actually pull back. And then we reverted right back to the trend for much of last year. More recently, however, you can see that lower red line in line with the pullback that we saw at the start of 2018. And if you focus all the way on the right-hand side of the chart, you'll see the latest read on retail spending is now in net negative territory. So the question being, can the consumer maintain even this lower moderate level of spending going forward? Well, it's going to be increasingly difficult, particularly as we see some of the one-off supports for the consumer begin to dissipate. One-off supports being able to ramp up credit to above pre-crisis levels, draw down savings to multi-decade lows, even that lingering support with filling up the family car with lower cost fuel from 2015, 2016, that too is beginning to dissipate. You're saying 2015, 2016. Yes, there is a multiplier effect that carries forward. Back then, we estimate that the average American family saved over $1,000 a year just by filling up the family car with lower cost fuel. Now, $1,000, I get it, it's not life-changing money. It's not Powerball winnings by any means. But folks, for the average American family, $1,000 is a tremendous amount of additional discretionary wealth to go out into the marketplace and spend. And in fact, what's so great about the American consumer, when we save $1,000, we don't spend $1,000. We spend $2,000 or $3,000 because we feel wealthier. That you laugh at. That wasn't a joke. This audience is all messed up. So there was this multiplier effect that was helping support the consumer for several years, but that too is beginning to dissipate as well. Going forward, let's talk about income, because in order to sustain the consumer, really the only factor that can do that is organic job and income growth. We talked about job creation, still positive, but remember we were losing momentum. What's happening on the income front? Well, income growth, as you can see, was pretty much stagnant in the early stages of the aftermath of the Great Recession. We started to see some upward momentum in 2015, plateaued in 2016. Again, in 2017 and much of last year, we were starting to see that upward trend return, and we've plateaued since in 2019. Now, if you just focus on the right-hand side of the chart, you may feel a little optimistic. Incomes are rising. We're feeling pretty good about that. But let's back up and take a longer-term view and talk about the fact that we're now in the 11th year of the expansion, and only recently are we talking about more moderate wage gains. If we were honestly talking about a sub 4% unemployment rate, as we have been now for years, and the minimal amount of slack that implies in the labor market, we should have been easily talking about 3.5%, 4.5% wage gains on a sustained basis for years, not just recently eking out tenths of a percentage point of improvement. The other concerns that I have is the recent gains may prove very short-lived. In fact, if we do see that R word, yes, recession, or anemic economic conditions, sometimes we get stuck on this word recession. If we see very anemic economic conditions lurking around the corner, The other concern that I have in terms of wage gains is they're not even across the economy. If you're lucky enough to have the engineering skills, the math skills, the IT skills, the craft labor skills, you may be seeing 4, 5, 6% annual wage gains. That feels pretty good. But what if you're in the service sector? What if you're in the manufacturing sector? What if you're in the mining sector? Your wages are struggling to keep up, even with inflation, at less than 2%. So the wage gains that we are seeing in the labor market are very much bifurcated across the haves and the have-nots, in this case, the skill havers and the non-skill havers. Maybe I could have said that a little more articulately, but I think you get my point. Now, with the very minimal gains in wages as we would see it, again, I feel very unsatisfied applauding tenths of a percentage point of improvement in wage gains. This will eventually eat into consumers' ability, as we saw, to make discretionary purchases, but it'll also eat into consumers' ability to make big-ticket purchases as well, like cars, or how about a home purchase? Home prices had been going up quite rapidly over the past several years, 4, 5, 6% on an annual basis, so 2 or 3 times the wage growth that we had been seeing in the country. But we finally reached a precipice in late 2017, early 2018, and at that point, consumers were simply unable or unwilling to make that home purchase. And since then, we've seen home price appreciation slow dramatically back down in line with slower wage growth. And we've seen this too in home sales. Home sales still positive, absolutely. But it's that second derivative decline, or a slower pace of housing activity. And in fact, if we look at this on a national basis, existing home sales growth has been negative for 17 of the past 20 months. So certainly a slower pace of housing market activity. Now, I do think it's important to get back to the idea that real estate is local. We tend to look at this from a national perspective, but there are still markets around the country that are seeing extreme upward pressure in prices. Some of the hottest markets in the country, immediately I think of the Nashvilles of the country, or some of the tech-driven submarkets, the Seattles, the San Franciscos. There we're still seeing some nice upward trends in terms of price pressure. We see here, you can see Oregon has slowed down to about 5%, so still positive, but noticeably down from a more robust double-digit pace in years past. But more broadly speaking, this is the general trend that we're seeing in the national economy. Again, positive price appreciation, but a slower pace. So we've gone from double-digit growth down to very low single-digit growth. But let's talk about the impact on consumers. As I mentioned, the inability and unwillingness for consumers to make that home purchase. Because even with a slower pace of price appreciation after years of rapid price growth, from a nominal price standpoint, the prospect of purchasing a home for many Americans is still unobtainable. In fact, if we look at a median income, average savings rate, median priced home, for the average American, this could mean saving for 20, 30, in some cases 40 years just to save enough for that 20% down payment to make a home purchase in some of the key cities around the country. Particularly in the California markets, you can see over 40 years, down in Miami, Chicago, where I hail from, a little more reasonable, only 19 years. But this is extremely onerous on the American consumer, that inability to make that home purchase. Even though prices have slowed the level of appreciation, we're still talking about an unobtainable dream for many of the average Americans. There's also an unwillingness to make that home purchase. Now, when we talk about housing market activity, one of the biggest components typically is first-time home buyers. First-time home buyers typically account for over 15% of market activity. That has slowed now to just about 30%. Some other statistics to fill in that storyline, a 15% increase we've seen over the past year of adult millennials reporting that they live at home with their adult parents. And when polled, Americans under the age of 35, 50% say they would simply rather rent, so a preference for renting over purchasing a home. They say, you know what, I saw what happened to my parents during the housing market crash. I'm not interested. Or I like the mobility. I want to be able to move from the West Coast to the East Coast, to the Nashvilles, to the Chicagos of the world, depending on job opportunities. The top two reasons, though, was that the flexibility, the top three reasons: flexibility, lack of affordability, so tying up so much money in terms of making that home purchase, and number three is the mounting levels of already existing debt plaguing some of the youngest Americans, particularly student loan debt. And just to make my point more dramatic, what we've done is index these different indices back to 2000 so you can see the dramatic run-up in student loan debt relative to the growth that we've seen in income, or even the cost that we've seen in terms of colleges overall. So a tremendous amount of student loan debt, over $1.5 trillion, really weighing on the minds of these younger Americans trying to make that decision to enter the housing market, something that's going to keep them sidelined, so they tell us, for several years to come, if not permanently. Now that's on the consumer side. Let's jump, if you will, to the corporate side. Let's do a time check here. Okay, talk about corporate America and see what's happening in terms of the business community. Now here, we seem to be a little more aligned with the Fed's assessment of conditions, acknowledging that business investment, manufacturing, these have taken a turn to the downside and slowed more dramatically. And absolutely, I think that's very clear early on in the recovery. So talking 2013, 2014, business investment was the silver lining of the recovery. We're talking near double-digit growth for years. We slowed dramatically into 2015, 2016, essentially back-to-back years of near zero business investment. Slightly positive, but we're kind of splitting hairs here. 2017, you can start to see that upward momentum. We plateaued in 2018, and more recently, as we talked about, 2019 business investment has been trending negative for the past 6 months. Now, back in 2017, what was happening in 2017? That businesses were feeling more optimistic, loosening those purse strings. I'm going to pretend I heard it. Tax reform, absolutely. Because not only was that impacting consumers, but it was impacting businesses as well. Tax reform, regulatory reform, healthcare reform, immigration reform, anything reform. Business community was excited, elated, if you will, about a pro-business agenda coming down the pipeline. Now, it wasn't just optimism that did help. We also saw an inventory cycle. Inventories have been drawn down to near zero levels after 2 years of negative growth. And so there was some restocking of the shelf, also some orders that had to be met, again, after back-to-back years of very minimal investment. But optimism did play a very large role here. Consumers feeling more optimistic about the recovery being perpetuated, and there was some very large flows of capital into new areas of investment, but we weren't able to maintain that. We plateaued in 2018, and more recently, as I mentioned, trending negative for the past 6 months. Now, not all business investment is equal. There's different areas of investment. And some of the areas that were the hardest hit, particularly more recently, was investment in equipment and structures. As businesses look out and they're seeing a very uncertain future for the American economy, they're hesitant to invest in new equipment purchases, new warehousing facilities, new office space, new manufacturing facilities. And we saw those categories particularly hard hit over the past 6 months. But the one area where we have seen consistent positive investment is in technology, research and development. Anything that drives higher productivity and helps lower costs. Now, investing in technology can be a little bit of a double-edged sword. It can be a little bit of a sensitive subject because on the one hand, as I mentioned, it can help increase productivity, which, let's be honest, has languished in this country for the better part of the past decade. But on the flip side, if we see companies investing in technology, automation, robotics, this can actually replace some of that labor component in the marketplace and perpetuate some of those downward trends in the labor market, particularly when it comes to wages. In fact, there's some great studies out there. One I'm looking here specifically for the Brookings Institute, and this says that 20% of the job market, 36 million jobs, are at high exposure of being replaced by technology. Another 52 million jobs, or an additional 36% at medium exposure of being replaced. Now, if we stop there, that sounds pretty scary. Robots are coming to replace our jobs. But that's only the first part of the equation. Because most economists would agree that technology is not labor replacing, it's labor augmenting. Meaning, yes, absolutely, some jobs will be replaced. But it will also create new job opportunities, new job opportunities for engineers, for computer scientists, for coders. Because remember, what we're talking about in technology is increasing productivity, driving down costs, freeing up capital to be invested in other areas that we haven't even thought of, creating new jobs in areas that we haven't even thought of. On the individual, humanistic level, absolutely, technology can be painful if you're the individual being replaced. But when we talk about this on a net growth standpoint, from a net standpoint on the economy's pathway to prosperity, technology is always a positive, help driving forward further growth and further future job opportunities and investment opportunities for the economy as a whole. And in fact, when we talk about reduced price pressures, I think this is a good transition. Let's talk about inflation a little bit, because I think everyone's excited to talk about inflation. We know that the Fed has a dual mandate: maximum output, full employment, we talked about that, and stable prices. Because this is the other component that's really going to be driving the Fed's decision of whether or not to cut interest rates, which is business people, but which is market participants. We care about where interest rates are headed. So this is the other component that could make that decision for the Federal Reserve. More recently, the Fed has been very hesitant to acknowledge the low level of inflation, the persistently low level of inflation. They've blamed it on one-off declines in cell phone prices. They've blamed it on low financial services costs as well, really not acknowledging the persistently low trend in costs. But more recently, they have come to acknowledge the fact that inflation has missed their 2% target, in fact, for the better part of the past decade, and the risks that are associated with a continued downward slide in inflation, which could lead then to a continued downward slide in inflation expectations, which becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. But it makes sense now why the Fed has begun to acknowledge the low level of prices. Looking here at the PCE, this is the Fed's preferred measure of inflation. And what we see is that both the headline and the core, which simply excludes food and energy costs, not because we don't pay for it as consumers, but because they tend to be the most volatile components. So we often strip that out from a policy standpoint just to get a sense of the more directional underlying trend. But in either case, both the headline and the core, as you can see, well below that 2% objective. Now, yes, to be fair, there was a period last year, if you remember at the start of the year, there was 3 months that we were above 2%. But since then, we've fallen back down below that 2% objective. So again, it makes sense why the Fed has now acknowledged the persistently low level of inflation, compounding potential arguments for further rate cuts as we move forward. Now, why was the Fed so hesitant to acknowledge the low level of inflation? There's kind of two stories of inflation in the economy at this point. If we're looking at goods costs, goods prices, which is the dark blue line, you can see we're in a period of outright deflation, so negative price growth on a year-over-year basis. This reflects the fact that we are a global marketplace. Globalization allows us to import cheap goods from abroad, which essentially we're importing deflationary, putting downward pressure on our domestic price indices. But when we talk about services, it's more difficult to import services from overseas. Yes, we can in terms of some call centers, et cetera, but we can't outsource your kid's soccer coach. That's a local service. And what we see is that services costs are much more well anchored and in fact above the Fed's 2% objective. But we can't have two monetary policies for the same country. And so taken together, what we see is that persistently and stubbornly low level of costs. Low energy prices have also been blamed for this temporary bout of disinflation. Low energy prices seeping into the economy, seeping into the calculation, but even if you buy into that argument that low energy prices have been keeping headline inflation restrained, it doesn't explain the low level of core inflation, which excludes food and energy costs. So we're still talking about a very clear disinflationary trend in the environment. Now, the third area, I told you the Fed has a dual mandate, but they have sort of this third unofficial mandate, and that is stability in global financial markets. So stable prices, full employment, their official mandate, but the third unofficial component is stability in global financial markets. And the Fed is increasingly concerned about the state of the global marketplace. Although again, for those of you that caught the press conference yesterday, the chairman suggested that the risks stemming from overseas have actually begun to decline in terms of the concerns over slower global growth, the risks of a hard Brexit, and of course, trade relations. Let's start with growth. Now, the Fed says that the risks to a slowdown overseas have begun to decline. I'm not necessarily seeing that. That may be a bit overly optimistic. When we look at the latest growth report, particularly from our European counterpoints, what we're seeing is an extreme slowdown in growth. Germany, the largest economy of the region, deep into negative territory, pulling down the key manufacturing sector, that yellow line, into contractionary territory. And when I say contractionary territory, it's simply a diffusion index, which means above 50 is expansion, below 50 is contraction. And as you can see, we're now well into contractionary territory for the past about 9 months. Italy also posting a big goose egg in the latest growth report. And while I would agree with the Fed that the prospects of a no-deal Brexit may have been mitigated somewhat, the prospects of a disorderly Brexit certainly remain very high. And that prospect of lingering uncertainty has dragged the UK economy further into negative territory. So when we talk about the risks of a global recession, when we talk about the risks of a global slowdown, there's still ample evidence that we're trending down, not a reversal back into positive territory. And in fact, that concern of a slowdown on a global basis has continued to put ample downward pressure on global rates, in some cases dragging yields down further into negative territory. When we talk about growth in terms of not just our developed counterparts, but how about our developing counterparts, some of our key trading partners, let's talk about China. Chinese growth has slowed to 6% in the latest report. Now you're saying, wait, that sounds pretty good, 6%? You were just telling us the US economy slowed below 2%. Absolutely, on a nominal basis, that 3 times what we're seeing here sounds pretty good. But for the Chinese economy, this is the slowest growth rate they've seen in decades. At 6%, this translates into a further decline in their key manufacturing sector as well. Again, that diffusion index falling below a reading of 50 for the past 6 months. And of course, here at the heart of the weakness, deteriorating trade relations. Now, both sides, the US and China, have actively engaged in this tit-for-tat, back and forth trade and tariff war, although more recently we have seen some concessions made. And it does look as if a phase 1 deal could be signed in November, the prospects of which encouraged the Trump administration to bypass plans to increase tariffs as of mid-October. And also, if it's signed in November, we have heard from officials that the Trump administration would be willing to bypass the next round of levies set to go into effect mid-December. Now, China is an export-dependent economy, so certainly we would expect the brunt of the pain in this trade and tariff war to be felt overseas, but the US will not escape unscathed. Anytime you talk about restricting the flow of capital, labor, goods, services, this will result in a net loss of productive capacity. This will result in a net loss of access to global markets, and in some cases, rising costs. Now, Oregon specifically is a trade-dependent state. There's a lot of trade activity coming out of this state with very close ties, very close relations with China. So no doubt there has been some local pain felt within some industries. But on a national basis, we have seen that pain felt more broadly. Looking at the domestic manufacturing sector, as we saw in Germany, as we saw in China, the US manufacturing sector has also fallen now into net contractionary territory. Looking at manufacturing payrolls, all the way to the right-hand side of the chart, you can see the extreme slowdown in hiring to about a third, if not less, of what we had seen in years past. Overall, when we talk about the impact of tariffs restrict the free flow, again, of goods, services, and labor, raising input costs, raising production costs. Now, there's different ways that these costs can seep into the economy. For a lot of consumers, we look to that final consumer good to determine whether or not tariffs are impacting us. We go to the store and that pop can that used to be 90 cents, is it now $1.15? That's how we often judge whether or not that tariff is impacting our everyday lives. But in many cases, businesses are now reporting they don't have the ability to directly pass on that cost increase to the consumer without the risk of market share. So many market insiders suggesting, as we did, looking at some of the earlier data of the consumer is on increasingly fragile footing and cannot absorb that cost increase. So what do? Well, they push that cost increase into the economy indirectly by either finding cost cutting on their bottom line, reducing wages, reducing hiring, reducing hours, or reducing all of the above. So tariffs can have an impact on the consumer. Although remember, it might not be directly going to the shelf, seeing that pop can increase in cost. We may feel that indirectly through other channels of that cost increase seeping into the economy. So what does this mean for the Fed going forward? What can we expect in terms of further policy adjustments? As I mentioned, we're all in the business community. We're all concerned about where borrowing costs are going. Well, at this point, the Fed has told us, as of yesterday, that the current level of policy is likely to remain appropriate. At the same time, they removed the language that the committee would continue to act as appropriate going forward. Now, you may say that's a little bit of a nuance here. I'm not sure what to take away from that. And it is a slight change in language, but it's an important change in language. Because the former, the new language that we see, that policy is appropriate, suggests there is a growing number of Fed officials that are increasingly comfortable with the current level of policy. And more importantly, that earlier rate cuts, so that 75 basis points of cuts, is already beginning to stabilize the economy enough that the Fed now may be able to back off and a pause is warranted. Although, when asked about that change in language, and when asked about why that language to act as appropriate was removed from the statement, the chairman simply said, well, he almost seemed to get a little flustered, to be honest. He said, well, it's just a judgment call. Sometimes we add things into the statement, sometimes we say things in the press conference. It wasn't in the statement, but I'm saying it now, he said. So essentially, the statement released yesterday seemed to have a more hawkish tone and imply that the Fed was poised to take a pause in terms of any further policy adjustments. The chairman's statement, however, suggests that now, more than ever, the Fed remains data dependent and will continue to act as appropriate. That very language was removed from the statement. So the Fed still at this point is keeping the door wide open for additional policy adjustments, not just at that upcoming December meeting, but beyond as we go into 2020. It's going to depend on the data. As we just walked through, the data is not easy to interpret. The data doesn't always point in the same direction, but the Fed is going to remain data dependent. Policy is not on a predetermined path, and if we continue to see weakness evident in the underlying economy, the Fed will, although maybe reluctantly, continue to cut rates to support the domestic economy. At this point, I think it's very clear that the market would like additional stimulus. Looking at the spread between 2s and 10s, which is a very traditional or historical measure in terms of whether or not policy is accommodative to market expectations, what we see is that after that October third round rate cut, we're still seeing a very flat curve, implying that market participants would in fact like to see additional stimulus. Now, unfortunately, our fiscal policymakers seem to be, well, their hands seem to be tied. Whether this is a divided Congress, whether this is partisan politics, I would not hold our breath in terms of expecting any type of stimulus out of the federal government. It seems like no one is playing very nice in the sandbox as of late. So the onus, unfortunately, does fall on our monetary policymakers to continue to provide artificial support for an economy that has a potential to falter further going into 2020. So again, if we do see the data continue to deteriorate, we would expect a December rate cut. We would expect further rate cuts in 2020 if the economy slows further. But remember, one of the caveats was that rates are already at historically low levels. So there's very little ammunition that the Fed has to cut rates to support the economy. Remember back going into the '07 recession? How much did the Fed cut rates? Over 400 basis points. This time around, we have half that. So if the economy does slow precipitously, it's very likely the Fed draws down interest rates to near zero levels, but then has to rely on non-traditional metrics, i.e. growing the balance sheet, or you may have heard of QE, outright asset purchases. Last time the Fed grew the balance sheet to a whopping $4.5 trillion. This time around, $5 trillion, $6 trillion, what's $7 trillion among friends? So overall, let's summarize what we talked about. There was a lot of information on a Thursday morning. Moderate domestic conditions. I don't want anyone to leave here depressed. We're still talking about positive growth. It's just that we're losing momentum. It's that second derivative decline. Hiring remains positive but less robust, and there's very specific industry components that are hiring, skills that are in high demand, low supply. That's where the wage pressures are going to be in the labor market, but it's certainly not even across all industries, across all categories. Business investment is very uneven at this point. Businesses are, however, willing to invest in technology, anything that can drive higher productivity and reduce those costs, which at the moment remain very muted despite tariffs because of that slowdown in global growth. So a slowdown in global growth trumping the impact of tariffs at this point. But tariffs will continue to disrupt the flow of goods and services, as we talked about, and we could see that indirect impact on the market through reduced hiring, reduced wages, or both. It doesn't have to be just that cost increase of the final good we're buying off the shelf. International uncertainty will continue to weigh on the markets and continue to weigh on the Fed. Again, a concern about geopolitical risks, be that Brexit, be that trade tensions, be that a slowdown in the global economy. Policymakers, while reluctant to do so at this point, will continue to provide support for the economy if we see a further slowdown. Now, you can argue that the bar of expectations for evidence has risen. Continued evidence of moderate growth may not be enough to force the Fed's hand. But if we see the data further deteriorate, the Fed will be willing and ready to provide additional support to the economy. But remember, their tools are very limited this time around. And with that, I would be happy to take any questions. And I think, join me up here for any local questions.
If you have questions, I believe what we have are mics on the sides, and go ahead and just either run up to one of them, or because it's a long way for them to go, so maybe meet them in the middle.
And it doesn't have to be questions. If something resonated with you particularly, or if just a general disagreement or comment, those are also welcome.
You're next.
Question for you.
On the left here.
GM strike's been settled. The Boeing 737 will fly again, probably first of the year. That's going to have a big impact on the economy. What do you think?
Well, we certainly saw the impact of the GM strike in the manufacturing numbers. There was some disruption, some volatility there. When you're talking about setting aside hundreds of parts and manufacturers, that certainly will have a disruption. But we tend to look at the manufacturing sector more on a broader-based, longer-term perspective. And even when we filter out some of that month-to-month disruption, we do see a very clear decline in manufacturing. So it may help on the margin, a few tenths of a percentage point in terms of that ISM measure, but we do see more broadly the manufacturing sector declining.
You mentioned that you thought that business investment would decrease in all areas except research and development. This is kind of specific to Oregon, but what do you feel about the gross receipts tax, and how is that likely to affect investment?
Well, it certainly wasn't, I didn't say that I expected to remain negative. That's what we're seeing in the data, that it has turned negative. And what we're seeing now is that's a reflection, not necessarily of policy, as you mentioned, but it's a reflection of the uncertainty that businesses are having. When they look out to the economy and they look at the prospects for growth, there's a lot of hesitancy. When you're talking about the domestic buyer pulling back, when you're talking about international opportunities being minimized, regardless of changes in tax policy, businesses are still going to be very hesitant to increase those outlays and investment if they don't see the end game picking up and more than multiplying that investment. So at this point, I do see the trend in investment remaining negative, businesses staying on the sideline. The only area where we have seen businesses either quantitatively or qualitatively indicate that they're willing to loosen those purse strings is on the front of technology or automation, something that they can immediately quantify in that bottom line to say, we saved X dollars, this is promoting our productivity levels, et cetera. So I don't think that policy is going to have that big of an impact on these broader trends, keeping businesses on the sideline.
Thank you for the presentation. We talk a lot about the possible downside shocks. I'm curious if there's anything that you're tracking nationally or internationally for an upside shock.
An upside shock. Let's be positive here. Well, I do think that one of the factors that we actually originally had modeled into our forecast was a very large infrastructure spending bill. This was the type of stimulus that we actually thought could have staved off weakness for a quarter, if not two, and potentially perpetuate into a sustained level of growth if we were talking about the type of infrastructure spending program that we originally heard on the campaign trail, trillions of dollars put into play to revitalize some of the antiquated roads, bridges, tunnels, schools, libraries around the country, which regardless of what side of the aisle you're on, I think most Americans agree that we have very antiquated infrastructure in this country. And in fact, we have heard from Democrats and Republicans, they both agree that we need to invest, but then of course it's a question of playing nice in the sandbox and who's going to pay for it. And unfortunately, that didn't come to fruition. I don't see that happening in the near term, but if we want to play sort of the wish game of what we could see in terms of upside potential, that is one variable that I think would have a very big upside potential boost to economic activity, at least near term.
When I hear the word tariffs, I think of tax on the American people. So one, is that correct? And two, what is the administration doing with that massive tax that's been collected from the American people?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the second part? I didn't hear this.
What has the administration done with that massive tax that's been collected over this last year?
Well, I think we know the answer to that. Spent it. And where, unfortunately, the government, it's very difficult to track. Money's very fungible, so it's very difficult to track the actual revenues. But what we see is that the government's balance sheet has become dramatically bloated. And again, regardless from a political standpoint, politics aside, just from an economic standpoint, it's very dangerous when we continue to see the government increase outlays to this extreme level, because there will be an increased burden on the American taxpayer to fund that spending. Remember, the government doesn't actually create anything. They simply take capital and reallocate it to where they see it to be a more efficient use. And at some point, with these increase in outlays, as well as, not to mention, just funding the government, right? We have to actually pay that back, the interest, the net interest on borrowing. This is going to raise taxes exponentially going forward. At some point, maybe we pay 60 cents on the dollar, 70 cents on the dollar, 80 cents on the dollar, 90 cents on the dollar, and this is going to continue to discourage, I think, a lot of participation in the labor force. So not only do we have these structural issues already in terms of labor force participation, but if you continue to increase that tax onus on the American public, well, we all know the Laffer curve. At some point, you're going to begin to tilt that Laffer curve, and people are going to drop out of the labor force. And then we get to a point where we don't have enough labor force participation to support the economy, support society, and society essentially implodes. Let's call that sort of the worst case scenario, but
Society imploding. Good.
I didn't mean to go there. That just kind of took an ugly turn. But that's sort of the longer term pathway that keeps me up at night. And in terms of your first comment, tariffs, absolutely, it's just a fancy word for tax. And again, as we talked about, that tax will translate into a price increase, whether directly for the end consumer going to the shopping mall, going to the grocery store, seeing that increase in the goods and that they're purchasing off the shelf, or indirectly by businesses simply being unable, I should say, to absorb that tax or that cost increase, reducing hiring, reducing wages, reducing investment, all of which has a negative implication for consumers and the economy as a whole.
Hello, I'm an ex-rancher from Sisters. Stifel has a new office here. We've just gone with them.
Yes, we do. We just opened that.
Yes, the Flex here are running it. While you're speaking, the House is trying to put in action to impeach our president. The Dow Jones, the Standard & Poor 500, the NASDAQ, as we speak, are all-time high. What do you think they're going to be next January? Is it a good time to invest?
I have to say that was one of the strangest lead-ins. I thought that was going to go to a very different question. I appreciate that. Well, in terms of the impeachment, I think, again, I'm not a politician. I'm not a Republican or Democrat. I'm an economist. So putting that aside, I do think that when you talk about impeachment, it does have negative implications for market confidence. Anytime you have this type of political uncertainty, whether it's a government shutdown, whether it's the threat of impeachment, whether it's just not getting along and this harsh rhetoric of partisan politics, that impacts American businesses, that impacts American consumers, and can often translate into a hesitancy to invest because we don't know the rules of the game. And as business owners, as business participants, if we don't know the rules of the game, we're not going to invest, we're not going to put capital at risk. So anytime you have this type of political uncertainty, this can weigh on the market, this can weigh on the economy. That being said, to your point, the market seems to not be focused on the political issues at hand. The market seems to be focused about the more positive policy green shoots that we've been seeing, particularly the prospect of a trade deal in November. I think that is by far the primary focus for the market, not the prospects of impeachment. The market is concerned about getting that trade deal, that phase one deal agreed to. And as we've seen 15 months of negotiations back and forth, a lot of this is optimism, a lot of this is hype, a lot of this is I hope, but the market is very much focused on getting that that phase one trade deal completed. And I do think that's helping, along with a relatively positive earnings season, some other positive comments from the Federal Reserve yesterday, all of this combined to help elevate equities going forward. That being said, if the economy does materially slow, this seems to be a pocket of opportunity because the market would, as we would expect, follow down or trend down with a decline in fundamentals. So if you are a long-term investor, obviously you want to have a well-diversified portfolio. If you buy into the notion with increasingly concerns about the recession, with the market at relatively elevated levels, this may be a nice buying opportunity for you. But of course, I'm not an investment advisor. I would refer you to your local investment advisor for specific advice on your portfolio.
They got to find a place to meet, not in Chile, right?
I'm sorry?
They have to find a place to sign the deal, Xi Jinping.
Yes,
not
location is
Chile.
very important. We need to find a place to sit down. And apparently, if you saw the news this morning, or I believe it broke last night, there's some confusion about exactly where that meeting will be held. But hopefully that's one of the last details. The more important details is really hammering out that agreement and then finding somewhere to sit down and sign. Hopefully that's just a little extra detail that they can work out.
So corporate America was given very large tax cuts a couple years ago. From your information, it appears that, well, we were told that it would add to the job wages and investment in various things, but according to your information, neither of those have happened. I've heard mostly that most of the tax cut money has been spent on stock buybacks.
Yes.
Is that what you're seeing? And what is your feeling on stock buybacks as they affect the economy?
So we did see a lot of the investment, actually, as you mentioned, go to stock buybacks, debt reduction, cleaning off the corporate balance sheet. This wasn't necessarily the primary intention for the corporate tax reduction. We did see some one-off increases in variable pay. Some employers gave out one-time bonuses, but we really didn't see this translate into a longer-term trend of permanent increases in income. Now, I do think part of this has to do with timing as opposed to the proposal itself. Tax reform is typically very positive for the economy. businesses take that opportunity to take that investment, and if it's not directly tied to increases in wages for existing employees, they use that to hire new employees, invest in other areas, et cetera. This time around, however, tax reform came so late in the cycle that many businesses were already cautious. They were already beginning to trim back investment. And with very liquid balance sheets, simply padding the corporate balance sheet with additional cash via the corporate tax, well, you couldn't really expect a change in behavior. So I don't necessarily blame the administration for the legislation in and of itself. The timing, I think, was ill-placed. Had we seen this type of corporate tax cut early on in the recovery, maybe during Obama, phase one, that would have given more of a lengthy time period for businesses to take advantage of this opportunity and put that additional cash to work. Now, of course, hindsight is 2020. We don't have the counterfactual to argue, so I can't promise you that had we seen that earlier, we would have seen a more positive impact. But based on earlier projections from past cycles, we would expect a more positive implication had that come years prior.
Lindsay, thanks for coming to Bend and providing lots of great information about the national picture. Some next questions for Damon. Maybe tell us a little bit more about income growth compared to maybe what it's done nationally, and talk maybe about employment in general in the manufacturing sector.
Yeah, so Lindsay brought up the fact that nationally the wage growth has been a little bit unimpressive. And it definitely has been. And obviously this idea, like I said, that the economy as a bunch of communities built upon, into this big city, every one of these communities is going to have totally different trends. And so when we aggregate up to the national level, the wage growth looked just unimpressive. But for us, it has been a bright spot of what's happened in our local expansion. And like I said, some of this is adding a lot of jobs in higher paying industries. This has been sort of that diversification narrative. A lot of our professional, technical, and scientific sector is growing like gangbusters. And it's lots of small companies, lots and lots of 5 to 10 person companies who either moved to Central Oregon in the last 8 years, or they went from a 5-person company to a 10-person company. And so we don't have, the white whales of, getting like a Tesla plant coming into Central Oregon and causing an explosion in jobs and wages. It's been really, from the ground up, really small incremental growth, which has been encouraging, really homespun. As far as trends within the manufacturing sector, it was one of the bright spots that we saw in Central Oregon, really from about 2014 through 2018. Really a strong period of growth in a time where nationally manufacturing has once again been relatively unimpressive. And for us, some of this was in the wood product sector, which is our bread and butter that we've had historically here. But for the most part, we were seeing this in sort of new age manufacturing for us. A lot of stuff that's going on in Redmond, a lot of metals and more advanced manufacturing. Building planes out at the Bend Airport again. We haven't built planes for a long time. Last time we did, bad things happened. But this time we're feeling good about building planes again. But so it hasn't necessarily been all wood product tied, which is really an indicator of the fact that the national housing market has been, with home sales and building activity being relatively low, it hasn't been a huge boom for our wood product manufacturers. But the rest of the manufacturing sector has done particularly well. What we've seen, though, is the slowing growth. We have this idea of some industries growing, still continuing to grow at a pretty strong pace, and a handful of other industries sort of flattening out. In the last year, manufacturing has been one of those industries that's flattened out. So we haven't really seen any growth in the last 12 months locally, but we had a strong period of growth. So it's not particularly concerning, and we're not seeing job losses or anything like that yet.
Damon and Lindsay, thank you so much for your presentations today. I had a question about, I think this is kind of for both of you. Aside from the housing market, what are the long-term implications of the rising student loan debt, and what can or is being done to mitigate those effects?
Take it. Oof.
So it's a very good question, and certainly student loan debt is something that we're watching. It has implications for the purchasing power of the future generation. So yes, I talked about it specifically in the context of the housing market, but large amounts of debt limits consumers' ability to spend on everything. Spend on cars, spend on homes, spend on discretionary purchases of going out to eat, buying that ski pass. So the mountains of debt can weigh on the consumer's ability to spend, and we're a consumer-based economy. So that should be a pretty alarming prospect, that consumers aren't able to do what they do best, which essentially in this country is go out and buy a big screen TV. And so it's going to weigh on consumers. It's also going to weigh on their confidence. There's a certain amount of stress that comes with that ample amount of debt that's weighing on our younger generation. Also, some students can see the impact of student debt and maybe choose to forego certain opportunities. Maybe they don't go to the school of their choice, or maybe they don't get an advanced degree. So this can also retard the ability for consumers to pursue the careers or the level of education that they want. In terms of addressing the student loan problem, I think a lot of this, it's a very uncomfortable conversation because I do put a lot of blame on the federal government. Because having unlimited, essentially, access to federal aid allows the universities to perpetually increase the cost of attendance. And I do think that there has to be some sort of, I hope you're not applauding for a rising cost of attendance there, but I do think there has to be some sort of reform in terms of the access to funding. Now, again, this is a very difficult conversation because we don't want to say that only certain curriculums are able to take on federal debt, but at the same time, we have to admit that society can't essentially support every little girl that wants to be a ballerina. We want to put our younger generation in areas and curriculums that are providing for them and prepping them for the industries and the jobs that are available out in the economy. So we need to have this discussion of what types of skills are we arming our young generation with. We want them to have the math skills, the engineering skills, the science skills. Antiquities is a very important area of study, absolutely, but that doesn't necessarily arm you with the math skills needed in today's technology age, in today's IT development age. And so I do think there has to be some of that uncomfortable conversation, and maybe it's not just at the federal level, maybe it's also at the household level. But I do think that there's many different caveats that we need to address in terms of the educational system, the financing of that education, and of course the expectations in terms of the job markets and equipping our young people with the skills needed to fill the job vacancies. Again, think of that JOLT survey. We have millions of jobs available, and the resumes coming across our desk, maybe your desk as well, they simply don't have the skills to fill that job vacancy. So why is a student coming out with $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 in debt, and they can't get one of those jobs available? There's a clear disconnect there. So I don't think it's an easy solution. I don't think it's a simple solution, but I do think that's maybe a couple of variables that I would think is a starting point to have that conversation and potentially find a solution. Unfortunately, I don't think the solution is simply extinguish all the debt. I do think that students have to have some sort of skin in the game, so maybe there's some sort of balance between the two. And again, I don't say that from a political standpoint, from an economic standpoint, because remember that debt burden has to be absorbed by someone. But again, those are, I think, some of the talking points that I would address first and foremost when talking about the student debt crisis, and I will call it a crisis.
And when you individualize it down to like the local level, it's interesting when I recently gave a talk for for Habitat for Humanity. We were talking about affordability in Central Oregon specifically and what it looked like for an average family with 2 kids to buy a home. And when you actually looked, I was using a house that was really doesn't exist in Bend, a $250,000 house. Good luck finding that house. But just as an example of if you could find the world's most affordable house in Bend, what would it look like for a family making just above the average wage with 2 young kids in childcare to afford this house? There was essentially no pathway forward for this family to buy a house that doesn't even exist in Bend. And that wasn't even taking into account debt loads. So if you took into account the fact that this young family probably has, at least one of the spouses has some version of student loan debt or auto loan debt or something like that, credit cards and other forms of debt, that becomes even more unattainable. So really, in order for a young family to sort of make it work, it's really hard to hodgepodge these things together, and you basically have to be lucky and not have a huge debt burden over your shoulders.
Okay, I think it's my job to wrap this up. I want to do a last shout out to Brooks Resources and our friends at Pacific Source for sponsoring Lindsay Piegza and Damon Runberg this morning. Give them a great Round of thanks.